The sharp rap on his study door was an unwelcome intrusion.
Marcus, hunched over a medieval manuscript, flinched, his meticulous annotations momentarily forgotten. He preferred the hushed reverence of archives, the predictable scent of aged paper and leather, to any interaction requiring verbal exchange. His life was a carefully constructed edifice of research, each stone laid with deliberate precision, insulating him from the chaotic demands of the present. The solicitor, a lean man with eyes that seemed perpetually narrowed by skepticism, cleared his throat. "Mr. Thorne, a significant development."
Marcus merely grunted, adjusting his spectacles. He disliked being addressed with such formality. "Your distant relative, a Horace Blackwood, has passed. You are his sole beneficiary." The solicitor paused, allowing the information to settle. He owned Blackwood Manor. The name resonated faintly, a whisper from some half-forgotten local history text. A place of exaggerated folklore, Marcus recalled. He dismissed such things as the fanciful embellishments of an uneducated populace. His interest lay in verifiable facts, in the cold, hard logic of the past, not its embellished fictions. He felt no connection to this Horace Blackwood, no grief, only a vague annoyance at the disruption. "A manor?"
Marcus finally spoke, his voice dry, and used to extended conversation.
"What state is it in?"
The solicitor offered a non-committal shrug.
"Remote. Substantial. And with a rather persistent local reputation." He handed Marcus a heavy, sealed envelope. "The keys. The deeds. A considerable estate, though it comes with its own peculiar legacy." Marcus accepted the packet. He had no intention of residing in some decaying monument to forgotten gentry. His small, functional apartment suited him. Yet, a historian's curiosity, a professional obligation to the past, pricked at him. To inspect a property of such alleged antiquity, to verify or debunk its legends, held a certain academic appeal. He would survey the contents, catalog anything of historical value, then divest himself of the property. Logic, as always, would prevail. The journey north was a descent into an increasingly desolate landscape. The tarmac surrendered to crumbling asphalt, then to a gravel track choked with weeds. Fields gave way to skeletal forests, their branches clawing at the perpetually overcast sky. He passed through a village that appeared less lived in than merely endured. Windows were boarded, paint peeled from every surface, and the few figures he glimpsed moved with a slow, almost mechanical resignation. On the outskirts, a structure rose like a forgotten monument to brighter times, the old cinema. Its grand, Art Deco facade, once vibrant, was now a canvas of decay. The marquee sagged, its letters long since vanished, leaving only rust-stained bolts. The double doors were gone, replaced by plywood sheets that had themselves begun to splinter. He slowed, a brief, academic interest peaking. Another relic, another testament to time's relentless march. It added to the pervasive sense of abandonment, a foreshadowing of the isolation ahead. Finally, the gravel track opened onto a sweeping, overgrown drive. Blackwood Manor loomed, a monstrous silhouette against the bruised sky. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, wrestled with the walls, claiming windows and obscuring gargoyles whose weathered faces seemed to sneer down at him. The very air around it felt different, heavy, still, as if sound itself struggled to penetrate its perimeter. Marcus parked the car, its engine ticking in the sudden,
profound quiet. He retrieved the heavy iron key from the envelope, its cold metal biting into his palm. The main door, a colossal slab of oak studded with rusted iron, groaned in protest as he pushed it open. A gust of stale, cloying air, thick with the scent of dust, damp earth, and something else, something indefinable, like forgotten dreams and petrified sorrow, rolled out to meet him. He stepped inside. Dust motes danced in the sparse beams, illuminating the spectral forms of shrouded furniture. The silence was not merely the absence of sound, it was an active presence, a dense, suffocating blanket that seemed to absorb his every breath. Marcus ran a gloved hand over a nearby mahogany console table. A fine, gritty layer of dust clung to the leather. He shivered, but dismissed it as the natural consequence of a neglected building. This was an old house, after all. Old houses were drafty. He moved deeper into the cavernous hall, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. Faded tapestries depicting hunting scenes hung like forgotten skins, their colors muted to an indistinguishable gray. His skepticism, a sturdy bulwark against the irrational, remained largely intact. Yet, a subtle disquiet began to gnaw at the edges of his composure. Not the quiet of an empty building, but a deeper, more profound stillness that suggested not absence, but absorption. The house felt less like an empty shell and more like a vast, dormant entity, holding its breath. He told himself it was the isolation, the sheer scale of the place, playing tricks on his perception. A historian, above all, valued objective observation. He would simply document, analyze, and then leave. He would not allow the fanciful superstitions of a dying village to cloud his judgment. He was Marcus, the rationalist, the keeper of verifiable truth. Nothing more. Marcus arrived in a borrowed sedan, its chassis grimy with road dust. The manor loomed, a hulking silhouette against the slate-gray sky, its stone facade scarred by centuries of weather. He felt no immediate awe, only the detached interest of a professional encountering an artifact of significant age. His skepticism remained an impenetrable shield. This was merely an old building, a collection of bricks and mortar, albeit a remarkably large one. He chose a vast, unfurnished room on the second floor, its tall windows overlooking a tangle of overgrown garden. The air inside was thick with the scent of damp plaster and aged wood, a complex aroma he mentally catalogued as the decomposition of organic matter. Unpacking his crates, he began to arrange his meticulously indexed research materials. Stacks of historical texts, folders bursting with archival scans, and his personal notebooks soon occupied a large, scarred oak table that dominated the center of the room. The methodical act of organizing was a familiar comfort, a bulwark against the inherent disarray of the world. The first chill was imperceptible at first, a faint ripple in the ambient temperature. He attributed it to the manor's poor insulation, the vast, echoing spaces. Later, while consulting a particularly dense volume on local land deeds, a distinct cold spot settled directly behind his left ear. It was sharp, localized, like a small patch of winter air had manifested indoors. He shivered, adjusting his posture, convincing himself it was a draft from a poorly sealed window frame, despite the stillness of the heavy velvet curtains. Then came the sounds. He paused, pen hovering over paper, straining to discern words. Nothing. Only the creak of settling timbers, the distant sigh of wind through the gables, the occasional scurry of something in the walls. He frowned, his mind already constructing theories of acoustic anomalies, of old houses acting as soundboards for external noises, or perhaps the faint echoes of his own blood coursing.
Days bled into a week.
Marcus fell into a routine, his hours consumed by research, punctuated by strong, black coffee.
One afternoon, he set his fountain pen beside his open journal, rising to consult a map unrolled on the floor. When he returned, the pen lay several inches to the left, nestled against a different book entirely.
He stared at it, a flicker of irritation, then picked it up. He must have nudged it, or perhaps the table was uneven. He tested the surface with his palm, solid, unyielding. He shrugged.
A momentary lapse in memory, a trick of the light. His mind sought the rational explanation, always. His research into the manor's architectural evolution led him to its less frequented wings. He was attempting to map its various additions over the centuries, noting the shifts in style and material. One afternoon, a dust-choked corridor, oddly modern in its layout compared to the rest of the structure, terminated at a heavy, unmarked door. It felt out of place, almost an afterthought. He forced it open, revealing a cavernous space. The air was stale, thick with the smell of forgotten popcorn and decay. Rows of moth-eaten velvet seats, many collapsed, faced a stained screen.
This was the old cinema, an inexplicable luxury added by some bygone owner. Behind the screen, in a small, damp projection booth, he found them. Not neatly stacked, but scattered, as if thrown aside in a fit of despair. A collection of leather-bound journals, their covers cracked and brittle, lay alongside loose, yellowed letters tied with fraying ribbons. The script was spidery, varying across the different volumes, suggesting multiple authors.
He picked up the topmost journal. The first entry was dated 1888.
The words were faded but legible.
August 14, 1888.
It seeks me out, a tendril of frost against my skin, though no window was open. My thoughts, once so clear, now drift like smoke. I find myself forgetting the simplest things, the name of my own steward, the day of the week. He assures me it is age.
But I am not yet old. The house. It watches. I feel its eyes upon me, though it has none.
Marcus felt a peculiar prickle on his arms. The language was archaic, dramatic, typical of the era. He flipped to another page, a different hand, this one more frantic. March 3, 1912. Not sounds, exactly, but impressions.
Thoughts that are not my own, suggestions that curl into my mind like ivy.
They speak of things I have not known, of places I have not seen.
My wife, she looks at me with pity. She says I am unwell. But it is not I. It is the house. It demands. It hungers.
Marcus closed the journal, the leather creaking softly.
Superstitious ramblings, he concluded.
The dramatic flare of troubled minds, perhaps exacerbated by isolation and the prevailing spiritualist anxieties of the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
He gathered the journals, a professional gleam in his eye.
This was a treasure trove of primary sources, offering a rare glimpse into the psychological landscape of previous inhabitants.
He would analyze them, dissect the language, contextualize the paranoia. It was all a matter of historical interpretation.
Yet, as he walked back through the old cinema, the collapsed seats seemed to watch him from the gloom. He felt a distinct shift in the air, a subtle pressure, as if the space itself held its breath. The faint scent of forgotten popcorn seemed to mingle with something else, something sharper, like ozone before a storm. He attributed it to the dust, the decay, the peculiar acoustics of the disused space. He was a historian, a man of facts, not phantoms. But the prickle on his arms remained, a persistent, unwelcome guest beneath his sleeve. He clutched the journals tighter. Marcus closed the journal, the leather creaking softly.
Superstitious ramblings, he had concluded.
He gathered the journals, a professional gleam in his eye, intending to categorize them, to cross-reference their inconsistencies, to dismantle their fantastical claims with methodical historical rigor. This was a challenge for his intellect, a puzzle to be solved with logic and evidence. His initial work involved mapping the family trees, cross-referencing names, and establishing timelines. The first whisper came during an afternoon of particular focus, a faint, almost imperceptible rustle of sound, like dry leaves skittering across a distant floor. He paused, pen hovering over a ledger. The house was old, he reasoned, full of settling timbers and drafts. He resumed his work. Later that evening, while sorting through a box of brittle photographs, a fleeting shadow detached itself from the periphery of his vision. It was gone before his head could fully turn, a phantom flicker. He blinked, attributing it to fatigue, the strain on his eyes from deciphering faded script in the dim lamplight. His skepticism remained intact, a bulwark against the creeping unease. Yet, his sleep became a fractured landscape. He dreamed of the manor itself, not as a structure of stone and wood, but as something pliable, breathing. Walls would subtly shift, their surfaces rippling like disturbed water. He heard faint, distant cries that seemed to emanate from within the very fabric of the house, muffled and indistinct. He dismissed them as the natural consequence of intense research and a new, unfamiliar environment. Despite his rationalizations, a gnawing curiosity began to assert itself. The consistent thread of unease within the journals, however embellished, suggested a core of truth, or at least a pervasive local legend worth investigating. He needed objective verification, external records that could corroborate or refute the bizarre claims of the manor's former residents. The manor's own library, while extensive, was too insular. His search led him to the remnants of the local historical society, now housed in a forgotten corner of the old cinema. The building itself was a relic, its marquee stripped bare, the entrance choked with weeds. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew, dust, and the faint, sweet decay of long-dead popcorn. Rows of tattered velvet seats, draped in plastic sheeting, stretched into the gloom of the auditorium. The makeshift archive was a small, cluttered office off the lobby, crammed with municipal ledgers, local newspapers, and various ephemera, all meticulously, if haphazardly, preserved by an elderly, bespectacled clerk. Marcus explained his purpose, requesting access to records pertaining to the manor and its previous inhabitants. For days, Marcus sifted through the town's archived newspapers and census records. He found the manor referenced with surprising frequency, often in conjunction with unsettling events. The first instance he found was a brief article from 1887, detailing the sudden disappearance of a resident, a reclusive scholar who had inherited the property. The article mentioned a thorough search, but no trace was ever found. Later entries spoke of the unfortunate demise of a subsequent owner, a woman whose melancholia was noted to have deepened considerably during her prolonged stay at the manor, culminating in an accidental fall from an upper-story window. Suicide, Marcus understood, reading between the lines of polite Victorian euphemism. He found a series of reports from the early 1900s detailing a succession of short-term residents, each exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior.
The common thread was undeniable: prolonged isolation within the manor, followed by madness, disappearance, or self-inflicted death.
Each account, when stripped of its polite phrasing, painted a picture of individuals slowly unraveling, their sanity eroded by an unseen force. The historical rigor he had intended to apply now felt like a fragile shield against the mounting evidence. The journals he had dismissed as superstition suddenly resonated with an unnerving truth. Back at the manor, the subtle phenomena escalated. He would turn abruptly, convinced he had heard his name, only to find an empty corridor. He found himself pausing, listening, searching the empty spaces, his breath catching in his throat. His logical mind fought against the sensory onslaught. He was tired, he told himself. Overworked, isolated. The manor was not merely old, it was a silent, insidious predator, and he, Marcus, was its latest inhabitant. The house was beginning to press in, blurring the boundaries between historical record and present reality, between the rational and the utterly, terrifyingly inexplicable. Marcus returned to the journals, determined to find a pattern, a logical explanation for the consistent thread of disquiet that ran through them. He arranged them on the large oak desk in the study, their brittle pages exhaling a faint, papery scent. He had dismissed the more outlandish claims as mere flights of fancy, the product of isolated minds. But a professional curiosity still pricked at him. There had to be an underlying truth, a historical trauma perhaps, that had been embellished over generations. The manor, however, seemed to resist his rational approach. Sounds, previously unnoticed, began to assert themselves. The creak of distant floorboards, not from above, but seemingly from within the walls. A whisper of air, cool and damp, that stirred the heavy velvet drapes even when the windows were sealed shut. He attributed it to the building settling, to drafts, to an overactive imagination fueled by the very texts he was studying. One afternoon, seeking a change of scenery from the oppressive stillness of the study, Marcus decided to explore the manor's less trodden wings. A wave of musty air, thick with the smell of forgotten decay and a strange, sweet undertone like old caramel, washed over him. He pushed the door open further. His hand found a wall switch, and with a hesitant click, a single bare bulb flickered to life, hanging precariously from the high ceiling. It revealed what was unmistakably an old cinema. Rows of dusty, moth-eaten velvet seats, many torn and spilling their stuffing, faced a stained, discolored screen. A projector sat like a forgotten sentinel in a booth at the back, its lenses opaque with grime. The air here was heavy, almost viscous, making each breath feel like an effort. Marcus stepped inside, his boots crunching softly on scattered debris, plaster dust, crumbling wood, and what looked like fossilized popcorn kernels. The silence was profound, broken only by the faint hum of the flickering bulb and the distant, rhythmic drip of water somewhere in the manor's depths. It was a place frozen in time, steeped in its own forgotten purpose. As he stood before the screen, a subtle shimmer caught his eye. It wasn't the light from the bulb, but something on the screen itself, like heat haze distorting the fabric. He blinked, rubbing his eyes. The shimmer intensified, coalescing into faint, shifting shapes. Then, a sound. Not from the projector, which remained inert, but from the air around him. A faint, whirring click, followed by the distinct, tinny crackle of an old film reel beginning to play. His breath hitched. The screen, impossibly, flickered to life.
It wasn't bright, but a muted, sepia-toned projection, wavering and indistinct. He saw figures. A gathering, men and women in antiquated attire, seated in these very chairs, their faces turned towards the screen. He saw the faint outlines of their smiles, the glint of their eyes, the subtle tilt of their heads. This wasn't a memory, not truly. It felt present. The scene on the screen within the projection shifted. It wasn't a film playing, it was a reflection of the room itself, but distorted, spectral. And then, one of the figures in the projected audience turned. His mouth opened in a silent scream, a sound Marcus felt rather than heard, a vibrating resonance in his own bones. The screen within the projection then showed something else. Not the room, but a close-up of a wall, one he recognized as belonging to the manor. The woman's silent scream intensified, his hand reaching out, not towards the screen, but towards Marcus, as if begging for help, for understanding. Her eyes, filled with an unbearable anguish, seemed to lock onto his. And in that moment, Marcus understood. The stain wasn't just on the wall, it was in the wall. It was part of the house. The house was not merely a setting for the horror, it was the perpetrator. His carefully constructed skepticism fractured like old glass. This was not hallucination, not an overactive imagination, nor the ramblings of the deluded. This was real. The manor wasn't haunted by spirits, it was the spirit. And it was watching him, tasting him, slowly, inexorably, beginning to absorb him into its vast, decaying memory. He was no longer an observer, he was becoming part of the tableau. Marcus remained at the oak desk, the stack of journals a brittle barricade against the encroaching silence. His initial determination, a historian's disciplined pursuit of truth, had begun to fray at the edges, dissolving into something more obsessive. Days blurred into a single, protracted vigil. He had not shaved in days, the stubble on his jaw was a rough, itchy blanket. Meals were forgotten, or consumed mechanically, cold, directly from their containers. His world had shrunk to the study, the hallway leading to the kitchen, and the occasional, restless wander through the lower floors. He had tried to reach out, at first. His mobile phone, once a constant companion, now lay inert on the desk beside a forgotten mug, its battery dead. He had remembered the landline, a relic in the study's corner. He'd picked up the receiver, the plastic cool and smooth against his palm. A dial tone, thin and reedy, had answered his call. He'd punched in the solicitor's number, then a colleague's, then a local acquaintance from the village. He'd tried sending an email, typing out a convoluted explanation of the manor's peculiar atmosphere, but the internet connection, usually reliable, had flickered and died before he could press send. The outside world, it seemed, had simply ceased to exist for him, or rather, he for it. He could almost taste the crisp air of the moor, feel the rough texture of the gravel drive beneath his boots. He pictured himself walking into the nearby village, perhaps stopping for a coffee, seeing familiar faces. He imagined driving past the dilapidated facade of the old cinema, its boarded-up entrance a silent sentinel of forgotten entertainment, a landmark he had always associated with the boundary of his isolated existence. But the image felt distant, unreal, like a poorly remembered dream. A profound weariness settled into his limbs, a leaden inertia that made the simple act of turning the knob seem insurmountable. The air outside, he reasoned, would be too sharp, too intrusive. The noise of the village too jarring. He retreated, drawn back into the manor's hushed embrace, the brass knob remaining unturned.
It wasn't overt, there were no slamming doors or overt manifestations. The faint creaks of settling timbers no longer startled him, they became a low, resonant hum, a kind of breathing. He found himself conversing with the manor in his thoughts, explaining his findings from the journals, detailing the patterns of despair and disappearance. His energy, once robust, now felt subtly leached away. He moved slower, thought slower, yet his focus on the journals remained razor-sharp. He often awoke feeling less rested than before, as if the manor had been drawing sustenance from his slumber. He neglected his personal hygiene almost entirely. His hair grew shaggy, his clothes wrinkled and stained. Yet, he hardly noticed. Such concerns seemed trivial, extraneous to the true work at hand, understanding the house. It was a constant, undeniable companion. He no longer felt alone, he felt contained. He was here, now, inextricably bound to the ancient stone and timber, a willing participant in its slow, deliberate consumption. He was no longer trying to escape, he was simply being enveloped, absorbed. Days blurred into a single, protracted vigil. The air, thick with the scent of aged paper and dormant dust, seemed to press in on him, a physical weight. A flicker in his peripheral vision startled him. The single oil lamp, its wick already trimmed low, sputtered, casting dancing shadows that elongated the heavy oak furniture into grotesque, predatory shapes. He blinked, the image dissolving, but the unease persisted. His mind, once a meticulous archive of dates and facts, now felt like a sieve, leaking coherence. He reread a passage for the third time, a chronicle penned by a previous resident, a man named Elias, detailing his own descent into the manor's peculiar logic. Elias's paranoia, his frantic notations about shifting walls and vanishing rooms, no longer seemed like the ravings of a disturbed mind. They felt like premonitions. He pushed back from the desk, the scrape of the heavy chair a jarring sound in the profound quiet. His legs felt stiff, his balance slightly off, as if the floor beneath him had suddenly pitched. He needed water, or perhaps just a walk, to reassert some control over his surroundings. He rose, navigating the familiar study, his hand trailing along the spines of the leather-bound books. Yet, as he reached for the door handle, he hesitated. He shook his head, dismissing the thought as a trick of the dim light and his own fatigue. He stepped into the corridor, intending to turn towards the kitchen, but found himself facing an unfamiliar stretch of wall. Where the tall, arched window should have been, there was only a seamless expanse of plaster, covered in a faded, floral wallpaper he did not recognize. A faint, sweetish odor, like decaying flowers and damp velvet, clung to the air. He frowned, his brow furrowing in confusion. This was not the main hall. He turned, looking back towards the study door, but it too was gone, replaced by a segment of the same wallpaper. Impossible. He pressed his palm against the patterned surface where the window should have been. The plaster was cool, unyielding. He walked slowly, tentatively, down the unfamiliar passage. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight, but the sounds were softer, less resonant than he remembered. The corridor twisted unexpectedly to the left, then to the right, leading him deeper into the heart of the manor, yet into spaces he had never before encountered. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of stale popcorn and something metallic, like old machinery. He rounded another bend and stopped dead. Before him stretched a vast, cavernous space, bathed in the sickly green glow of emergency exit signs. Row upon row of dusty, velvet-upholstered seats faced a colossal, stained screen. He stared, utterly bewildered.
He had explored every inch of this manor, or so he believed. There was no mention of a cinema in any of the architectural plans, nor in Elias's frantic journals. Had he walked through a portal? Had the house truly shifted around him? Or had his mind finally fractured? He reached the front of the cinema, gazing up at the screen. He chose a seat in the third row, sinking into the surprisingly soft velvet. As he sat, a memory surfaced, unbidden, vivid, the excited chatter of a crowd, the flickering anticipation of a projector's beam, the sweet taste of illicit candy. But these were not his memories. He closed his eyes, pressing his palms against his temples. The memories persisted, morphing, intertwining with fragments of Elias's writings. The images are not my own, yet they feel more real than my own past. Marcus heard Elias's words in his own mind, delivered in a voice that was eerily similar to his own, yet not quite. He opened his eyes. On the screen, faint, ghostly images began to coalesce, black and white figures, indistinct, moving in a silent, jerky pantomime. A man with a severe expression, clutching a journal, appeared. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow, yet it was not entirely unwelcome. It felt natural. He was Elias. He felt the weight of Elias's despair, the gnawing hunger for understanding that had driven the man to madness. Marcus's own name, his own life, felt distant, a forgotten dream. The historian, the skeptic, was gone. There was only Elias, trapped in this house, watching his own past play out on a screen that materialized from nothing. He looked down at his hands, seeing not his own familiar, calloused fingers, but hands that seemed older, thinner, marked with ink stains. The house had not merely disoriented him, it had rewritten him. He was no longer Marcus. He was a vessel, a new iteration of a mind already consumed. The walls of the old cinema, the very air, seemed to hum with satisfaction. He was trapped, not just by the manor's shifting architecture, but within the labyrinth of a borrowed mind. The oak desk had become an island, its polished surface reflecting the flickering lamplight Marcus now relied on, the windows having long since ceased to offer anything but a uniform impenetrable gray. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting shadows of the manor and the ever-present chill that seemed to seep not just from the stone, but from the very air itself. His initial rigor, the historian's unflinching pursuit of truth, had eroded. His meals, when he remembered them, were dry biscuits and cold tea, left untouched for hours. Memories, once sharp and ordered, had begun to fray, certain details of his past life, the face of a colleague, the layout of his old apartment, now elusive, like wisps of smoke. He found it in the fifth journal, tucked between a detailed account of a harvest festival and a terse entry about a sudden illness. The previous owner, a woman named Eleanor, wrote of the draining. Not a fever, she insisted, but a slow, insidious theft of vitality. My thoughts thin, he had penned, her script growing shaky, my past, a landscape obscured by fog. The house hums with a quiet contentment. A few pages later, a single, sprawling word, hunger. The previous inhabitants, all of them, had recorded similar experiences, a gradual fading of memories, a loss of energy, a sense of being perpetually observed. One entry, from a man named Thomas, spoke of the flicker, moments where the manor would warp, presenting him with impossible scenes, fragments of other lives. I saw myself in an old cinema, Thomas had written, his words barely legible, the projector whirring, but no film. He rubbed his temples, a dull throb intensifying. The room seemed to expand,
the walls receding into an indistinct gloom. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of dust and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like forgotten blood on dry leaves. Marcus was no longer seated. He stood, or rather, hovered, in a vast, echoing space. Before him stretched rows of velvet seats, tattered and faded, their plush surfaces coated in a fine layer of dust. This was it, the old cinema from Thomas's journal. It was real in a way that defied logic, and imposed reality that felt more solid than the manor study he had just occupied.
A low, persistent hum vibrated through the floorboards, resonating in his chest.
This wasn't just an illusion, it was a feeling, an emotional resonance that wasn't his own.
This wasn't a haunting. This wasn't residual energy.
The manor wasn't a stage for past tragedies, it was an active participant.
It consumed.
It reached into the minds of its inhabitants, extracting memories, siphoning sanity, devouring life force. The flickering visions, the loss of personal history, the encroaching emptiness, these were the symptoms of its feeding. The manor was not merely old, it was ancient, sentient, and unspeakably hungry. He thought of Eleanor, of Thomas, of all the unnamed souls whose fragmented lives were hinted at in the brittle journals. They hadn't gone mad from fear, they had been drained. Their memories, their very essence, had been absorbed, processed, and assimilated by the manor, strengthening it, making it more potent.
It was digestion.
The old cinema flickered, the velvet seats seeming to ripple like dark water. Marcus felt a jolt, a sharp, disorienting pull. The hum intensified, a low growl that vibrated through his bones. He was losing himself.
The manor was taking him.
It was not a metaphor. It was a terrifying, undeniable truth. He was its current meal, its preferred nourishment, and every moment he spent within its walls, every memory it stole, every fragment of his sanity it devoured, made it stronger, and him, weaker. He was trapped, not by walls or locks, but by a malevolent, living entity that fed on his very being. He was not just in a house, he was in a stomach. The air, thick and cloying, pressed in on Marcus, a physical weight against his chest. The lamplight's erratic pulse mirrored the frantic beat within his ribs, each flicker elongating the shadows into predatory forms that writhed on the walls. Memories, once sharp and distinct, now frayed at the edges, bleeding into indistinct impressions.
He could feel the erosion, the slow, deliberate gnawing at his identity.
A sudden, fierce surge of defiance, cold and clear as mountain water, pierced through the miasma.
This was not merely fatigue, not a breakdown.
This was an entity, ancient and malevolent, attempting to consume him. A raw, visceral no erupted within his mind, a silent shout against the encroaching oblivion.
Driven by this desperate, fragile spark of lucidity, Marcus shoved himself upright, the armchair groaning in protest. He needed to move, to act, to find something, anything, that could break the manor's hold. His gaze swept the library, not for books of history, but for anomalies, for anything that felt out of place, a physical manifestation of the manor's secret. He stumbled, his legs feeling heavy, as if moving through deep water. The shelves seemed to sway, the titles on the spines blurring into an illegible script. He clutched at a heavy oak table, his knuckles white. It was a sound he hadn't noticed before, or perhaps had dismissed. It felt mechanical.
He followed it, propelled by an instinct that bypassed his faltering reason.
He navigated the labyrinthine corridors, each turn feeling both familiar and utterly alien. He descended into deeper gloom, the lamplight from the upper floors failing to penetrate this subterranean space. A heavy, bolted door, obscured by decades of dust and cobwebs, stood before him. Before him lay the vast, decaying expanse of an old cinema. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light, thick as snow. Rows of once plush velvet seats, now ripped and stained, stretched into the murky distance, their stuffing spilling like morbid entrails. The air was thick with the ghost of stale popcorn and forgotten perfumes, a poignant echo of laughter and shared fear. A massive, tattered screen dominated the far wall, its surface scarred and discolored, like ancient parchment. The projector booth, a raised alcove at the back, drew him. It was a relic, a behemoth of cast iron and brass, its lens a cyclopean eye staring blankly at the ruined screen. Resistant. He ran his hand over the cold metal of the projector, the surface gritty with decay. His fingers brushed against a small, almost invisible latch on the side of the machine. It gave way with a soft click. Behind it, nestled in a hidden compartment, sat not a film reel, but a small, leather-bound journal. Its pages were brittle, the script faded and intricate, written in a hand that felt both familiar and utterly foreign. As Marcus carefully opened it, a faint, metallic tang filled the air, like old blood. The journal was not a diary, but a series of observations, sketches, and cryptic notations. It detailed a ritual, a specific series of actions involving light, sound, and a precise alignment of certain physical objects within the manor. It spoke of a focal point, a locus of memory, and a way to disrupt the consumption. The language was archaic, veiled in metaphor, but the intent was horrifyingly clear. This was a desperate, dangerous method to combat the house. One passage, underlined repeatedly, caught his eye. The feed must be severed at its source, not merely starved. The journal hinted at a volatile energy, a risk of total annihilation, not just for the manor, but for the one who dared to attempt the ritual. It was a terrifying gamble, a knife-edge path between destruction and utter oblivion. As Marcus absorbed the terrifying implications, the old cinema began to stir around him. A low, guttural growl rumbled from the depths of the manor, vibrating through the projector's iron frame. The projector, silent moments before, emitted a soft, mechanical whir, its lens glowing with an internal, sickly green light. The manor had felt his defiance, and it was preparing to retaliate. He clutched the journal, its pages now feeling impossibly heavy, a terrifying burden of desperate knowledge. He felt the insidious tendrils of the manor tightening, not merely around him, but within him, probing for weakness, for a point of surrender. Yet, a stubborn core of defiance persisted. He would understand this place, even if it meant his unmaking. He moved, pushing through the oppressive atmosphere, his destination the library. He believed the answers, or at least a weapon against this encroaching malevolence, lay buried in the manor's own records. The floorboards beneath his heavy boots groaned, a sound that no longer felt like settling wood but a living sigh. Marcus stood frozen, straining his ears. He fumbled for his emergency lantern, his fingers clumsy with a nervous tremor. When the beam finally cut through the black, it revealed a subtle, yet profound shift. The familiar hallway had subtly warped. The wallpaper, once a faded floral pattern, now seemed to ripple, the motifs twisting into leering faces that vanished as the light touched them directly. He tried the handle. The house was actively impeding him. He took a step back, surveying the impossible door. It was too solid, too permanent to be a mere illusion. He pressed his palm against the rough wood,
feeling a faint vibration, a hum that resonated deep in his bones. He struck it with his shoulder, a futile effort, but a necessary release of his building tension. The door remained impassive. Turning, he tried to retrace his steps, but the way back had become a labyrinth. The corridor stretched endlessly, familiar portraits replaced by blurred, indistinct shapes that seemed to shift with the periphery of his vision. He pressed onward, his determination hardening into a brittle resolve. He pushed through a heavy velvet curtain, expecting to find the drawing room, but instead stumbled into an expansive, cavernous space. The air here was stale and thick with the scent of dust and forgotten popcorn. Before him, rows of tattered, velvet seats stretched towards a massive, moth-eaten screen.
This was an old cinema, its grandeur long since decayed, now a tomb of lost entertainment. A low, flickering light ignited on the screen, bathing the derelict space in an eerie glow. Marcus watched, transfixed and horrified, as images began to form. Not a film, but a tapestry of memories, his own, distorted and malign. He saw flashes of his childhood home, his parents' faces contorted in silent screams, their features melting like wax. He saw himself, younger, vibrant, slowly fading, becoming translucent, a spectral outline against the backdrop of this very manor. The vision on the screen was designed to show him his future, his absorption. She didn't move, but her presence was a physical weight, pressing against his consciousness. He recognized the profound, bottomless despair in her stance. This was not a projection, this was an echo, a fragment of a previous inhabitant, trapped and replayed for his benefit. The house was showing him what it had done to others, what it intended for him. He felt the house attempting to pry into his deepest fears, to unearth the rawest pain. It sought to erode his sense of self, to convince him that resistance was futile, that his memories, his very identity, were already forfeit. He saw flashes of forgotten disappointments, of minor slights magnified into colossal betrayals, all playing out on the dusty screen. The house fed on the dissolution of will, on the surrender of the individual. It didn't just consume memories, it consumed the capacity for self, leaving behind only echoes and fragments, like the woman beside him. Marcus squeezed his eyes shut, a guttural sound tearing from his throat. He would not internalize this horror. The woman remained, staring at the screen, her silent agony a testament to the manor's power. He ran, stumbling over the collapsed seats, his mind racing. The house was not merely a structure, it was a hungry, ancient consciousness. It was fighting back because he was fighting it. He had seen its mechanism now, its true, horrifying purpose. It wanted his identity, his essence. And that, he realized with a terrifying clarity, was something he could still protect. He just needed to find a way to sever the tendrils before they consumed him entirely. The way out, he now understood, was not just physical, but an act of profound, desperate self-preservation. Yet, a cold resolve had settled within him, hardening the edges of his terror. Retreat was no longer an option, only confrontation remained. He moved through the decaying halls, his footsteps muffled by layers of dust and fallen plaster. The floorboards groaned beneath him, a symphony of decay that seemed to anticipate his every move. His hand, slick with nervous sweat, clutched the heavy, iron key, its cold metal a grounding presence in the swirling unreality. He had found it tucked beneath a loose flagstone in the manor's oldest cellar, an artifact not just of access, but of defiance. But beneath these familiar sounds, a new hum began to resonate, low and steady, vibrating through the soles of his boots.
It was a sound he hadn't consciously registered before, yet it felt intimately familiar, like the pulse of an ancient, sleeping beast. The hum grew louder, more insistent, as he descended a narrow, spiraling staircase he'd never noticed until now. The steps were rough-hewn stone, worn smooth in the center by centuries of unseen passage.
Each downward turn intensified the feeling of being swallowed by the earth itself.
The air grew heavier, denser, pressing against his eardrums, and the metallic scent sharpened, almost acrid. He could taste it now, a coppery film coating his tongue. At the bottom, a heavy oak door, studded with rusted iron, stood before him. No handle, no visible lock, only a single, deep indentation perfectly sized for the key he held. He pushed the key into the slot.
It slid in with unnerving ease, clicking into place.
A faint, internal mechanism whirred, and the door, with a groan that seemed to echo from the manor's deepest foundations, swung inward. Beyond lay an expansive, cavernous space, shrouded in a gloom so profound it seemed to absorb the meager light from his lantern.
This was the old cinema.
He knew it instantly, not from any prior knowledge, but from an overwhelming certainty that settled in his bones. The air here was still, thick with the scent of mildew, decaying fabric, and something else, a faint, lingering perfume of human expectation, of hushed anticipation, now corrupted and sour. He stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind him with a resonant thud that vibrated through the floor. Each image shimmered, then dissolved, replaced by another, a silent, perpetual projection of memory and despair. He moved slowly down the central aisle, the brittle fabric of the seats crumbling under his touch.
The floor felt uneven, as if the very ground beneath was undulating.
His breath hitched in his throat. This wasn't just a room, it was the manor's maw, its digestive tract. The screen was its eye, its window into the past, into his past.
From the projector booth, high above and behind the last row of seats, a faint, rhythmic clicking began.
It was the sound of an ancient mechanism whirring to life, a ghostly echo of long-dead technology. Marcus looked up, his gaze drawn to the small, square opening in the booth's wall. He could feel an immense pressure emanating from it, a gravitational pull on his sanity. That was the core. He gripped the heavy, leather-bound journal he carried, its pages filled with the cryptic symbols and desperate warnings of previous inhabitants. Its weight felt inadequate against the overwhelming malevolence surrounding him. As he reached the front of the cinema, standing directly before the monstrous screen, the images intensified, coalescing into terrifyingly familiar scenes.
He saw his own childhood home, distorted and crumbling. He saw his parents, their faces dissolving into grotesque masks of anguish.
He saw himself, younger, smiling, then that smile twisting into a silent scream. The hum vibrated through his bones, and the air crackled with an unseen energy, raising the fine hairs on his arms. He looked back at the projector booth. It wasn't a physical entity, not entirely, but a manifestation, a guardian of the manor's heart. Marcus felt the truth of the manor's hunger in that moment, not just for memories, but for the very act of memory, the continuous recreation of self. It was a parasite of consciousness. His hand tightened on the journal, its worn cover a testament to the struggles of those who came before him. He had come too far to falter. The final confrontation had begun. He was no longer certain if the ground beneath his feet was solid stone or merely a convincing illusion. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, usually confined to the overgrown garden, now permeated the manor's interior, mingling with a faint, metallic tang that prickled the back of his throat. His vision swam, the familiar angles of the hallway dissolving, reforming into something else entirely. The wallpaper, once a faded floral, now rippled with faint, ghostly images, faces contorted in silent screams, hands reaching from unseen depths, all dissolving into the pattern before he could fully grasp them. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that these were not mere hallucinations. A new sensation arose, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated in his teeth. The wood felt ancient, scarred, almost organic beneath his trembling fingers. He pushed, and it swung inward with a groan that echoed like a dying breath. His lamp cast a meager circle of light, revealing rows upon rows of faded velvet seats, arranged in a gentle slope towards a colossal, blank screen. He had stumbled into an old cinema, nestled impossibly within the manor's labyrinthine core. This was not a memory, not entirely. It was a physical space, yet saturated with the essence of countless forgotten evenings. Marcus moved down the aisle, the plush seats exhaling tiny clouds of dust with each step. He felt a profound sense of wrongness here, a place designed for collective experience now utterly bereft, yet teeming with an unseen audience. He reached the front row, his gaze fixed on the screen. It wasn't blank for long. The faint projector beam intensified, and a flickering image began to coalesce. The corridor itself was familiar, it was one of the manor's own. Then another image overlaid it, a man, his eyes wide with a desperate, understanding horror, clutching a book, his lips moving in a silent scream. This wasn't just a projection, it was a consumption. The manor wasn't merely collecting memories, it was replaying them, digesting them, absorbing the final, most potent moments of fear and despair. The flickering images were the last vestiges of individuality, processed and consumed, becoming fuel for the entity that was the house. He was watching the manor feed. And then, his own face appeared on the screen, superimposed over the others. A moment from yesterday, his brow furrowed in concentration over an ancient text. The images sped up, fragmented, distorted. His thoughts, his feelings, his very identity were being pulled apart, spliced into this gruesome montage. He saw himself, but he also saw countless others, their lives interwoven with his own, their fears echoing his, their ultimate fate mirroring what was now unfolding before him. The individual threads of consciousness were unraveling, becoming part of a vast, terrifying tapestry. It was a composite sound, a chorus of voices, indistinct and ancient, sighing and murmuring in unison. It wasn't language, but pure emotion, the essence of fear, sorrow, and resignation. It filled the vast space, pressing in on Marcus until his eardrums ached. He was standing on the precipice of absorption, his own consciousness about to be pulled into this collective stream. He had to fight. He had to wound it. But how do you wound an entity that is the very space around you, an entity that feeds on the intangible? His eyes darted to the projector booth high above. The source. If he could reach it, if he could destroy it, perhaps he could stop the feeding, break the cycle. The climb to the booth felt endless, each step an act of defiant will against the crushing weight of the manor's influence. He reached the door, flung it open, and found himself face to face with the ancient machine. It hummed, a low, guttural thrum, its single lens gleaming like a malevolent eye. Without thought, Marcus lunged, his hands seeking purchase, his fingers closing around a heavy metal lever. He pulled, grunting with effort, every muscle straining. A sickening crack echoed through the booth, and the lever tore free from its housing. The projector sputtered, coughed, and died. The beam of light vanished. A profound, absolute silence descended, deeper and more terrifying than any sound.
The screen was black. He had done it. He had wounded it. But the silence was not empty. It was filled with a new kind of awareness, vast and ancient. He felt the manor, not as an external force, but as an internal presence. The tendrils he had felt tightening were now within him, not binding, but integrating. He felt the hunger of the manor, a deep, pervasive craving that was now, somehow, his own. He looked down at his hands, expecting to see them trembling, but they were steady. Too steady. He closed his eyes, searching for his own thoughts, his own memories. They were there, yes, but they were no longer singular. They were interwoven, tangled with others, with centuries of other lives, other experiences. He could recall the taste of a stranger's last meal, the sight of a child's forgotten toy, the exact shade of despair in the eyes of a former resident. Marcus opened his eyes. He saw the currents of memory still flowing, albeit weakly, through the very fabric of the building. He felt the manor, wounded but not dead, stirring, reforming, drawing in the fragments of his struggle, making them its own. He had not destroyed it. He had simply become another part of it.